It was important to me to tell the story of John Brown and George Stearns and this relationship that influenced so many people, and that it all happened here at Tufts. It happened right down the road. It happened where the gym is. George Stearns was a resident here of Medford. His home was called the Evergreens. It was right on the other side of College Avenue. He was a businessman who was devoted to the abolitionist cause. He was a universalist and had a moral problem with slavery. And when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, he harbored runaway slaves at the Evergreens. We walk by the little rock that says, "Here stood a stop on the Underground Railroad." He became increasingly vocal about his thoughts about slavery as the years progressed. And he became involved with a group of men who were banding together. They called themselves the Secret Six, and they were supporting John Brown's ideas for what eventually became the raid on Harper's Ferry. John Brown began to make fairly regular trips to Medford, to the Evergreens. He knew that he could come and talk to not only George Stearns, but with George Stearns' wife, Mary, about the money that was going to be needed to fund his plans. I feel like the relationship between the two men was both supportive and strained. John Brown was certainly a dynamic personality. He was able to rally this support for these activities that some people did not have the stomach for. Although George Stearns was devoted to the same cause that John Brown was devoted to, George Stearns was very much a behind-the-scenes kind of a man. When John Brown made the raid on the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, he was captured. George Stearns took a train to Montreal at the advice of his lawyer and tried to distance himself from John Brown at that time. Stearns eventually came back from Canada. He was called to the Senate to answer for his part in the raid. A couple years later, as the Civil War continued to progress, he was tapped by the governor of Massachusetts to muster the 54th and 55th Regiments of African American soldiers. That was a job that he undertook with a lot of pride and excitement. At about the time that all of this was happening, Tufts College was in its earliest days. Being Universalists, George and Mary Stearns were interested in the college, which was Universalist, and decided to leave their estate to Tufts. Mary Stearns also commissioned a bust of her husband by Samuel Morse. That bust and the bust of John Brown were both, for a time, on view at the Evergreens. When Mary Stearns died in 1902, Tufts College took ownership of the Evergreens estate and some of the contents of the house, including the bust of John Brown and the bust of George Stearns. It's interesting to think the two busts were languishing in storage, strapped to the same pallet for almost 50 years. So even though they had this awkward relationship in life, they were bound together not only through history, the busts of them have been bound together in the same way.